Um, about 10 years ago, I came across the story of Jane Anderson. So she's one of the two main characters, but she's also was a real journalist, a real reporter. She came to fame when she was in her 20s during the First World War, where she was kind of an adventuring journalist. Where she was the first woman to fly in a biplane over London. She was the first journalist to ride in a submarine and actually go underwater. And she reported from the trenches on both Allied and German sides during the war, and got a fair amount of fame from that. But we don't really know about Jane because of her contributions to women's rights, or she's not remembered for that, because she was one of the radio traders. This was a group of American actors and journalists who broadcast propaganda on behalf of the Nazis, mostly before the U.S. got into the war, but with the purpose of getting the U.S. into the war, but on the side of Germany. So more or less, Jane, I think, would have been remembered more fondly, except that she turned fascist. Yeah. But really, the War Begins in Paris is not Jane's story. It belongs to that young woman from Iowa, Marta Hess, who I mentioned earlier. But her struggles to contend with the threats of her time, her upbringing as a radical pacifist, which is an important part of the story, but also what she comes to believe is her destiny. So I'll just go ahead and jump in. This first chapter is called A Story of Two Women. One was famous for her audacity, her beauty, her appetite for headlines. The things that made people love her were the same things that made people hate her. The other woman, nobody ever noticed her. They met in Paris in 1938, working as foreign correspondents. Jane Anderson spent most of that year on a speaking tour to rally support for the nationalist side of the Spanish Civil War. She had a way of putting herself at the center of a story, so it was no surprise that she was one of many journalists who took up a cause célèbre. Hemingway and Dos Passos and Gellhorn advocated for the elected republic. The socialists, the peasant soldiers who fought with birding guns and conspired to blow up bridges. Jane, on the other hand, sided with Franco and the clerical fascists. She was a strict Catholic. Ardent, anyway. Jane was strict about nothing. And she took it personal how the Republicans burned cathedrals and wanted to nationalize all the lucre owned by the church. Jane loved the church, all its pompous glory, the glittering robes and golden crosses, and the little chime a burning censer made swinging from its chain with incense smoke trailing behind. Much the same as she loved the pomposity of fascists and their claims to empire. That kind of ambition was addictive to some, aspiring to rule the world as the Romans did, as Charlemagne did, to make themselves a link in the chain of history. Not to say the church and the fascistas were the same thing, but in Spain that decade, in Jane's heart, they were close enough. But there was more to her than her politics. Some facts about Jane Anderson, largely undisputed. She was born in Atlanta in 1888. This made her 50 when she met the other woman, though Jane always claimed to be younger than she was, 36 at the most. Her mother came from a good family. Lucky Street in Atlanta is named for her grandfather. She was given his first name, Foster, though she took on Jane as an alias when she attended Piedmont College, and by the end of her life, she responded only if addressed as Doña Juana. Her childhood was split between Georgia and Arizona, where her father was a lawman and a confidant of the showman Buffalo Bill Cody. Jane knew him as Uncle Buffalo. She was 5'9", with deep-set green eyes and tawny red hair she wore long, curled at the bottom. She was partial to she hats, dangling peacock feathers, pert silk bows, long jackets with epaulettes on the shoulders. At one point she laid claim to being the most beautiful woman in the world. In those days, she seduced Joseph Conrad, a national hero in Britain, and made a ludicrous bid to usurp his fortune. Her only defect, it was said, was her nose. Her nose was broad, the nostrils too prominent, and it made her look common to those who knew what a nose should look like. A phrenologist claimed, because of the shape of her nose, that she was prone to sociopathy, that she was a born liar, that it would be a crime if she ever reproduced, and she never did. Jane reported for the Daily Mail from both Allied and German trenches during the First War as the personal protege of publisher Lord Northcliffe. She began carrying a Red Cross uniform to pose as a nurse, to sneak in where journalists weren't supposed to go, then kept up the habit her entire life. After the war, she was an alcoholic, a failed actress. Her star fell. It became known that her life was a complete mess, as she wrote about her exploits in the news in 3 novels. She stalked H.G. Wells. She hatched a scheme to assassinate Lenin. She accepted marriage proposals from at least 24 men, but was married only twice, once to a famous composer and once to a Spanish count who finagled a royal wedding at the Gothic cathedral in Seville as a bridal gift. Despite the honest commissions she made as a correspondent, and that she was typically surrounded by rich men, she was almost always broke. She spent her whole life chasing money, as people do when they grew up teased with affluence that isn't really theirs. Jane Anderson was one of the most baffling, provocative women of her generation, and she knew it. Most people struggled to resist her field of gravity. The other woman, the one who had a talent for going unnoticed, was only 24 when the Second War started. She had been in Paris less than a year when she met Jane. This was her first time more than 50 miles away from the Mennonite assembly in Iowa, where she was born. It was a remarkable thing to make a jump like that, though by all appearances, she was an unremarkable woman. As a girl, she was raised to value simplicity, sobriety, pacifism, and patriarchy. She and her siblings were educated at a public country school with children from neighboring farms, and she made regular trips to the town library to read its cloth-bound editions of German poetry and the collected works of Friedrich Schiller, which instilled in her an appreciation for personal freedom. At home, she spoke a dialect of Pennsylvania Dutch. She was also fluent in Iowa-inflected English and could speak German with a low accent. She was a dour child. That was a strange trait for children in her assembly, where kids were typically mischievous and genial and overcome by boisterous laughter at any provocation. When she left home at age 16, the librarian in Kelowna arranged for her to attend Coe College in Cedar Rapids. When she left, according to the law of her commune, she could never return. She belonged to the rest of the world thereafter, if it would have her. This young woman was tall and had dark hair, a square jaw, long swinging arms. She moved like a stork stuck in mud because her legs had suffered severe nerve damage when she fell from an oak tree as a child. The muscles of her calves could not untense. In college, she spent most of her free time reading magazines in the school library, which was her way of learning about the world that existed outside Mennonite farms. She discovered a few women journalists who reported on war and politics. In back issues, she read first-hand accounts by Rebecca West and Jane Anderson. Yes, Jane. She saw Jane's stories about life and death in the trenches of Flanders. These were women who made their own way in the world, whose intelligence and appetites apparently weren't held against them. She wondered if Rebecca or Jane had ever been promised in marriage to a 50-year-old bachelor farmer named Yoder, but she was certain they had not. When she arrived in Paris in the spring of 1938, she took a furnished room in a hotel in Montmartre. This woman could read and understand French, but was hopeless when it came to speaking. Iowa was too heavy on her tongue. She wore tan shirts and slacks and a long canvas jacket that resembled a butcher's smock. She wandered the city alone at night. She was tall and glum and limped. Nobody bothered her. Nobody talked to her at all until she discovered the community of war journalists and bohemian poets and trust fund novelists who then lived in Paris. They were everywhere when she learned how to spot them. Really, the story's about this woman. Her real name was Martha Hess, but they all called her Miel. Jane gave her that name. She and Jane would meet in Paris. Jane would be a corrupting influence, as was her custom. They would spend every evening together for a torrid month to waylay the cabarets of Montmartre and observe a flash of violence during the November pogrom firsthand. Then Jane would vanish from Miel's life just as quickly as she appeared. Miel would feel so lit up inside to have a wild friend like Jane Anderson. How unexpected it was that someone like herself, with her limp and her simple country manners, could be an intimate of someone like Jane. Someone like this young woman who was raised on a religious commune to be the exact opposite of women like Jane. How strange then, how fitting, that Miel would be plagued by visions and would one day cross the border into Germany with the intention of killing her friend Jane. But that's not where the story starts. And I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Okay. Should I do what's easier?
Oh, let me.
Should I stand up?
Oh, let me grab the microphone.
It's given me a chance to thank Rachel and Sarah and the bookstore for having us here tonight. It's actually the third time I've read here, so it's always a kind of a touchstone of having a new book out, so that you're going to come back to Magers and Quinn, so excited to be here.
Well, Ted, that was fantastic. That's such a great opening to the book. I want to ask, I guess I want to start with one of the sensations I had while reading it. It's so evocative of our own moment. And not in a way that, like, I think it's functioning as like an allegory, but like the resonances are so clear. I just wonder if you want to talk a little bit about kind of the politics and the struggle of representing fascism in a way that isn't overblown but isn't underselling it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of why I started writing this book was just my experience where I was a reporter for 16 or 14 years and reporting on the 2020 presidential election. I think it made me want to write a story about journalists who acted in good faith and maybe like defended democracy and defended humanism in a positive way that I didn't necessarily feel like I saw happening when I was working. Also, this idea of like American fascism that was coming out so strongly and witnessing that. Somewhat like going back into historical fiction to represent that. I think was more of the instinct, maybe just because I was writing about it on a daily basis or at least a monthly basis when I was at work. So like I was engaged on that level. But it was interesting to move back in that way once I got into researching the book. A lot of the research I did was reading memoirs, was reading diaries of journalists who were working in the 30s in Europe. And there seemed to just be a lot of similarities about things. And how they were constrained in their work, just a lot of things that were happening, kind of the same tropes that had come back, and just like, do you undersell the threat of fascism, which I think, then and maybe in the late teens and in 2020 here, it was a big struggle about how do you talk about this and are you being hysterical, which I think we still kind of have that struggle. So I think I started writing the book not necessarily as therapy, but just as another way to think about these same kind of issues and to try to bring it out to the public's attention in a different kind of way than I had been doing as a reporter.
So that tension then I think is really intriguing, especially once the book does move into Germany. Some of the ways that you represent sort of iconic moments with a sort of a biting realism. Like I'm thinking specifically about, and this is not a spoiler, but the rally where Hitler speaks, and it's just so Miel is sort of underwhelmed, even as she's caught up in like the grandeur of the moment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, I mean, was somewhat like personal experience of working so many rallies. So largely my job, like I'm from Omaha, so I report in the Iowa caucuses was a lot of the work I did. So following candidates around or just going to rallies. But largely it's really boring work. I think like TV, like I appreciated how hard it was for TV news shows to make it look like it was really interesting most of the time, because a lot of it's just standing around, especially if you see someone multiple times. It's just the same speech over and over, and then they find clips to make it sound new. So I think some of that idea of it was bringing that out. And again, when I was researching, I'd read stuff like that, where I think it did become a big thing in the 30s for American reporters that you have to see Hitler. Like, how could you say you were there if you never reported on a Nazi rally? But then I think a lot of them were kind of underwhelmed at the same time. Like, that idea of thinking about like the physicality of it, or this idea of the master race, but most of the people who were the big Nazis didn't really represent, at least physically, the ideal that they were talking about all the time, and they were pretty grotesque, most of them. So bringing that out, I think like the biting, kind of like the more satire of it, maybe just come from being a beat reporter where I never had a chance to offer commentary on anything. So like, but in my fiction I could do that, right? Like I could make fun of people and it's fine.
So, and this is maybe, I think it's beautifully done, like technically done, in the representation of Jane. There's such like a compulsive attraction and repulsion at the same time, and Miel kind of talks about that.
Yeah, because it is like that perception of her, which like we talked a little bit about in that introduction, thinking about like her reputation as one of the most beautiful women, at least like in her youth, and like how much she held on to that and used that to her benefit. And there still is, when I started researching her, a lot of the stuff I found were like blogs in Spain, where there's still kind of a cult following of Jane Anderson, specifically in Spain, where she lived the rest of her life out in Spain, and like her connection to Franco. But it was very odd to see that. So I think that idea of just like, again, like someone, like a movement that was so focused on like vigor and youth and, you know, being physically stronger and better than everyone else. But like what happens when that's not true, or like, you know, when the reality portrays something different, or their bodies betray them in different ways. Which is also just very human, I think, like writing that character, like I could get into that so much just because it's a natural phenomenon too, you know, even if the person experiencing it doesn't want to admit it.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of the bodies sort of failing them, because that is a real theme throughout the entire book, whether it's Miel's limp, or Hitler's sort of unimpressive stature, or even like Jane performatively talking about the injuries she's experienced. And yeah, how did you end up deciding that this book would become so bodily?
I don't know that I guess some of it was conscious. Like, I think I always try to start there when I'm writing. There's a Junot Diaz quote that I don't know, I won't butcher it, but it's basically like, if you're going to write about people, you have to start in the body, just because that's all of our experience, right? So if you want to understand someone, you have to understand what it's like to be in their skin and what they face. So I try to do that in all of my writing. But I think especially like this, once I got into it, thinking about Miel, who has like her limp and her little disability, but something that, you know, she tries to hide but struggles to hide. I think I just thought of that in terms of thinking about how my mom is epileptic, but if she had been in Germany at that time, she would have been sterilized, and which would have meant I never would have existed. But just thinking about it in those kind of terms, where I don't know, I mean, that's a big extreme, but just, you know, like how people, like we all have something to some level too. So exploring that in a character like that moves into that world where her disability could, you know, threaten her well-being. in an artificial way or in a way that she doesn't already have to deal with, was something that really drew me into that, and I think helped me understand her more too. Just like that thing to like, I could always come back to like that physical existence that she had.
Can I ask, I guess I have a question about Iowa, and then I have a question about the genre. Let me start with Iowa. And just think about, again, Iowa is such a place, it seems so remote from Nazi Germany or occupied Paris. How, was that your way in? Was that your way out? Like, how did Iowa fit in the development of the novel? Were you always going to start there?
I think it was, I mean, it was my way in to writing the book, because I had the idea of it on this kind of like higher level of like the fascist journalists, but then the humanistic journalists that were fighting against them, and like that was the original idea, like I want to write a book about that. But then I was really nervous, like I don't know, my previous 3 books are mostly set in Nebraska, so it's like, how do I write this book in Paris and convince other people that like I have any authority to do that? Which is somewhat the nice thing about being a fiction writer, is that, I don't know, you can just go for it. But like having the main character be from Iowa maybe just kind of reassured me that I could. So the fact that I don't speak French, or I'm not an insider, maybe got some stuff wrong. But you know, if the main character was making these same mistakes, I didn't have to be perfect, because Miel wouldn't be perfect either. So that was somewhat of the entry into that.
So then the question about genre kind of, I think, flows from that. Did you always conceive it as noir? Or where, like, when and how did it become noir? And what do you think that noir element has?
I think for me, where it came from was probably just the writers I started reading about. Like, I mean, before I even started working on the book, but Patrick Modiano, who Parisian writer who writes these Paris noir books, won the Nobel in 2014, and I started reading him then and just really got into it. So especially when I was writing the book and even researching it, I was just reading him a lot. So he could teach me about Paris, and I could understand these neighborhoods in a way, maybe with that level of authenticity that I didn't personally have. So some of it was just mimicking that and seeing it. But I think it did make sense in this kind of way, like just like thinking about Nazism or fascism as a sort of like organized crime, which I think is a really good way to think about it, and just like their function, their goal. These kind of gangsters that use physical violence, and they just took over the whole government, though, which most mafia groups don't, or at least not to that level. So it just kind of made sense in that way, thinking about on the level like this crime and the noir of it. A lot of like the winters during the war, which I learned too, were the coldest in the whole century. So it was just very dark and cold there too, and it just kind of fit.
It creates this really fantastic environment, and like we were talking at dinner, and I don't mean this in any way as a critique. But it's a novel that feels cinematic, and some of that I think is like noir lends itself to that, the color palette, whatever. But yeah, it's a novel that just immediately feels visual in a way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in some ways that's just kind of my approach to it, but maybe, you know, thinking about genre, it's just a lot less interested in kind of the internal experience of the people going through the story, and more about what's happening. And especially writing about Paris, I think, you know, Paris has its own personality and kind of asserts itself as its own character in the book. So that makes sense on that level too.
That said, there is a really interesting interior element, especially to Miel, and I don't want to give the game away, but she possesses a remarkable sense of interiority that sort of erupts at various moments.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, because I mean, it's like that struggle, is she controlled by, I mean, it's the same with like her limp too, like is she controlled by these elements of who she is, or can she, you know, overcome them?
I guess the other question that I have, and this will kind of be my last one, I think, because I do want to leave time for questions from you all. Do you think Miel's role provides us an example? Like, do you think that humanism, that sort of, she's not naive, but this sort of indefatigable belief in the goodness of what she's doing is the way out?
I think, I'm not sure that I do have an answer to that, but I think that was the central question that I came to when I was writing the book so much, especially after getting that hook that she has this idea that she should kill her friend. But again, like, her being Mennonite is so central to that, like being raised radically pacifist, which was a lot of the reason, like, how I came to her character in the first place, or like putting her in Iowa. Like, I wanted a character who was so committed to pacifism and the belief in, I don't know, the human soul and those kinds of worth. But then putting her in that situation where she does have to make a choice like this, where, like, is it for the better good to choose violence, I guess. But I think that is a huge question throughout the book, and even up through, like, the epilogue and the end, she kind of still struggles with that even after she has made her choice in different ways. But I don't, even coming back to the research, like, because I kind of had that question idea, but I learned so much about many Mennonites who left the farm in the last century, and a lot of why that kind of Orthodox Mennonite movement started to fall apart in Iowa was because of World War II, where so many of them, like, felt like the threat and what was happening in Europe was so dire that they had to give up their pacifism, and they left the assembly and they would join the military. Which, when I learned about that, seemed like such an intense thing. Like, I don't know, I was not raised Mennonite, so I don't know exactly how that feels. But just to imagine, like, someone giving up the core tenet of their being to address this thing, like, it's a big thing. So I think that fed the character a lot too, and kind of deepened that question of the book about, like, what do we have to give up in order to do the right thing.
There's a sense of, like, how is she willing to corrupt herself in order to prevent the spread of corruption? And you can see a similar thing with the historical experience of the Mennonites. Am I willing to engage in violence in order to prevent the further spread of violence? There's the Thomistic idea of the just war. It's a remarkably morally complex question.
I do think, like, I mean, just being involved in politics and reporting on it, I think we've seen a lot of this on the left in the last 15 years, this idea about not caring so much about the moral high ground of a situation, and, like, does it really matter if you have the moral high ground if you're always losing the fights? And I think that has changed quite a bit in the last 15, 20 years. But then it's like, I don't know, the idea, like, what is the outcome of that? And if nobody is concerned about the moral high ground, where does that leave us as a country? Again, like, some deeper questions that are above my pay grade, but it's interesting to watch and to think about. And I think as a storyteller, like, how do you represent those kinds of struggles is something I do think about.
I want to leave aside all my questions about Lukács and the historical novel, and I will hit pause and just sort of see from you all if there are questions you wanted to ask Ted.
Wondering if you could speak a little more about, you were saying you were maybe less confident writing about Paris or, outside of your own personal experience, and I understand you got maybe comfortable with that with the protagonist from Iowa, but what kind of, like, research did you do, or what other things did you do to, become capable of evoking that time in history?
I mean, I always kind of start in other fiction, so I mentioned, like, Modiano, and reading, like, other French novels, reading like other Americans in Paris, books from that era. This was not as much as I thought, but I also won a National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship in 2020 with the idea that I would spend most of that summer in Europe writing this book and researching it, which I got 6 days in Paris. And then I was on the last United flight back to the States when everything was shutting down, and then had a lot of time at home to work on it. But I think it was, I'm glad I went, which in some ways, like, was foolish. But at the same time, like, I spent those days finding a place for Miel to live, so I could walk around her neighborhood in Montmartre. I knew what building that she'd live in there. Got a sense of just like the seasons too, so like what the weather would be like. So those kind of things I think lend authenticity to it, but also just give me a lot of confidence to maybe do more into it. Like always starting with that. I think my approach to character usually, so this is my second novel that has the main character as a woman too, which is often a question I get, either like why I did that or how I did that. But I always try to start off with commonalities with that, just that like, gender is a lot of our experience obviously, but there's like so much more that we have in common. So like trying to start off in those moments. So like giving Miel a character trait that she's hungry all the time. So like one, like, she has a goal, like she wants food, so that drives the narrative a little bit. But it's also something we can all understand too, it's just like being hungry, or being a nervous eater or something like that. So like going around like Paris and learning about that kind of stuff, I think that was the entry into it, and could expand on it.
I have to say, having been a grad student, I appreciated that she is very drawn to events with free food.
Yeah.
Oh, and as a reporter too, like that was always the thing. Like you could tell how much they, like if they wanted good coverage or how much they wanted you to like them when you were covering a campaign by how well they fed you.
I was going to ask, because a lot of us have been watching the election since 2016, and we're on our way to the 2024 elections. And what is your take on what's going on right now with this book? Sorry.
That's a big one.
Totally.
I do think about it a lot. Like I haven't been a reporter for 3.5 years now, and like I definitely still follow politics and keep up on it, but not in the same kind of way I did then. And I kind of like that. Although like when I was a reporter, my favorite thing is that I just knew so much was going on, and I was just plugged into, like, mostly in the city I lived and stuff, but I always thought that was, just like that level of involvement and knowledge was a cool thing to be a part of. I think for this year, it's hard to guess what will happen. Like it's pretty clear, like we have two candidates, but at the same time, like way more than normal, one or both of them may not actually end up on the ballot in 10 months, 9.5 months. Just like the level of chaos that could happen seems to be the most notable thing. And just, it's like one of those things, and we talked about like just being a reporter, not being able to just kind of say the obvious thing, but just how bizarre it is to have a major presidential candidate who's also in 4 criminal trials, and just like all of these things going on is just like, it feels like fiction. Like like if I had written this novel 15 years ago or something, like nobody would have bought it. But it's the reality we live in now. So like to me, like I don't know, it's just like it's hard to kind of process all of that, or like how do you talk about things, or if I still was a reporter, like how do you write about these things, especially when like half of the people like won't, like maybe more, I don't know, maybe when 80% of the people aren't really all that interested in hearing what facts you're talking about anyway.
Is there a sense then that, because the journalists in the novel are all fairly clear-eyed about what they're seeing, even Moreau and some of the older generation. Do you see in your own work then sort of a critique of your previous career, like the failure to call a thing?
A little bit, but it's always easier to like look back on people and say, well, they had more guts and they just went for this, when a lot of the times it wasn't true, like because they were still being censored throughout the 30s, and most of what they really felt wasn't actually going out. And like not that they could have done anything about it, or like they could have quit and protest and then never worked again, which wouldn't have accomplished a lot. But I think it is that kind of struggle where it really took almost a decade before major newspapers would let them report, or radio, which was becoming really major at the time, would let them just kind of say what was happening. Like Ken Burns' documentary on the U.S. and the Holocaust, I think it was last year it came out. It was really telling about that, where like it wasn't really until I don't know what, like 44 or 45 that major news was like acknowledging that there were death camps, even though it was like 3 years before that, and there had been concentration camps for over a decade before that. So it was just very slow for stuff to come out, and wasn't nearly as neat, I think, and tidy as we kind of think it was. I was gonna ask Sarah, how do you feel about the election?
Well, it's getting kind of interesting. It's, yeah, I feel very not heard or listened to at the moment. And I just feel like we're kind of in like a weird matrix kind of point where it's just like, are we really even caring anymore of what's happening, or are we just like kind of just keeping it to ourselves and just kind of just shoving it in down until nothing's there anymore? So that's kind of how I feel right now.
Which I think, to me, that's kind of the major story right now is like the low number of people that are actually excited about the candidates that we have. Like, I don't think, at least like in my lifetime, and like, that we've ever had a situation like that. Again, like, I don't know, mostly it just doesn't feel good, and like I don't know how that resolves. But it's not a good situation, I don't think. Thank you.
Let me ask you, Ted, and this might be, I don't know how it works in a creative writing classroom, but I'm intrigued by your students' response to this. Have they, are they drawing these parallels? What are they seeing in the work and how it reflects basically Sarah's question? How are they responding to the text and the world that they're looking at, both in the novel and then the way it's reflected in the world back to them?
Yeah. So it is. Normally, like in creative writing, you don't talk about your own work, which is kind of weird in a way because I feel like almost every other discipline on campus, like that's the reason you're in the room is to talk about your expertise. But I did do a class last year where it was a methods class, and I kind of walked them through how I researched this novel and then invited them to do like smaller exercises that were similar. And it did seem, kind of similar where they just like that idea of like not being heard or not feeling like it was worthwhile to participate, which is not like all that new for college students, of course, but I think it is just kind of scary on that level, where a lot of them were kind of activists in other ways, but it was just that like politics was like has no possible good outcome, and even like historically in this way that it was just like, well, it's interesting to think about, but like I don't know, they're just all of the futures they imagine are very dire. It seems like there's no utopia to them.
No, there's not.
Do you see similar, like, because you've taught like utopia, and like, do you see that with your students too and their outlook?
Yeah, they certainly were less drawn to even Mary Wollstonecraft than to Ta-Nehisi Coates, and just the idea of what future is available, and that idea of like the future isn't one we co-create, it's one we inherit, and inherently our inheritance is being whittled away.
Yeah. Except, I feel that a lot, especially with my seniors now, because they were freshmen in fall of 2020, and just like, they would have been, freshmen in high school in 2016, and so like, I don't know, like, it feels like being the old person in the room, you're supposed to admonish them for not, like, I don't know, being more hopeful or working harder towards stuff, but at the same time, it's just like, I don't know what to tell you, like, you do you. do you try to like talk them into stuff though too, or like this idea of hope, or that like the future is something that we create and that you have to be active to do?
So I struggle with this now, especially at the U, working with med students, where like we need you to be thinking about a better future, also like thinking about working with medical students where roughly 80% of clinical outcomes are determined by non-clinical factors, and yet we're not training physicians to think about the environment or housing or policing or inequality, and like, so how are we training, and I think this comes to a lot of our students, they're so hungry for the way that engineering or STEM connects to the conversations we have in the humanities around the social roots of our experience and the social practice of doing something better or different. Yeah, that they really are hungry for even as they're told that like what we do doesn't matter or ends up close your ears working in a bookstore. You know, like even
Yeah.
as they're
I've
told
heard it.
that even
Yeah,
as they're
feel
told
that,
like,
feel
what
that.
we do brings them
Yep.
to the future,
Yeah.
they're hungry for what we allow them to think differently about.
That is really interesting because I think I do struggle with that. Or, I mean, teaching at a private school that has a really high tuition too, or like how do you get students into humanities, and like are we doing them favors by doing it? But I also, I don't know, I just kind of tell them like the joy of it, like, or a good life where you're following your passions and thinking about things that make us better humans, is a good thing to do. But also just like you have to kind of have that faith that life will work itself out, and that like the solution when you're 35 is not going to be clear to you when you're 22. I don't know that they always buy it, but it seems like something that needs to be said at least. And I don't know, I love the work you do so much, I think, for that reason. And like having a lot of pre-med students too, like that idea, like it is just so vital, and like how much of our economy is part of healthcare now too. Like, I don't know, like in another 30 years, if half of all workers are going to be healthcare workers, it's something that needs to be addressed.
It's also, and I think this book kind of ties to it, there's nothing more subversive than joy.
Yeah.
And Miel kind of really characterizes some of this. The ways that joy and the self can be disruptive to social norms.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right. Last chance. Did you have a question? You don't have to. Okay, good. Anyway, we can wrap it up then. So books at the front. If anyone wants to get one signed, I'd be happy to do so. But thanks a lot for listening. Thanks, Matt, for the conversation.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah.